This is the guy that nobody else in the land had more power than except for the king himself. And these guys come over. They would have had royal garments. They would have been part of the royal household. So they come in, and there's a lot of, I tend to think they actually came from Mesopotamia, I'm sorry, Persia, because when the Persians later on overtook Babylon, not Babylon, when they overtook Constantinople, there's a church there. And the reason it was not destroyed, everything else in the town was destroyed except for that church, is because on the top of the door frame of the church, there was a picture of the three kings coming over, and they had the same garb, the same kind of outfits, these pointy hats, that the Persians used to wear. And, you know, the historical people come up and they say, well, the reason that's there is because when the Persians came in and took over, they realized, hey, wait, these guys were honoring us in this building, so we're going to leave this building alone. Now, that's conjecture, so don't take that as fact, but I tend to believe it. But regardless of where they come, they make this trip. And the interesting thing about this is they're not Jewish. They make, by some estimates, 1,000-mile trip through the desert to go worship a king that they've heard about, but it's not going to be their king. And that sounds kind of odd, but that wasn't abnormal for that day. If you lived in a neighboring town or a neighboring city and you knew that a king had been born or a new king had come into power, it was not uncommon for you to make a journey there or to send people from your court to make a journey there to sort of make a peaceful accord with them. It's kind of like when somebody moves into the neighborhood. You know, you could take them a housewarming gift, or you come by and help them out, and just make sure you get to know your neighbors. Politically, they wanted to do that same thing. So it wasn't that odd that these guys would make a trip, but it was odd that they would make this trip to a promised king that there was no political news from. You knew when a king came into power. There was great pomp and circumstances, and they'd send messengers to all the neighboring kingdoms and let these kingdoms know, hey, we have a new king. There's somebody in the throne. Come and see him. And you would come and you would bear gifts to this new king. But the only thing that announced the kingship or the king that had been born to the Jews was a star. And that's kind of an oddball event. It wasn't uncommon for them for people in ancient days to associate celestial events with a great political event. When Alexander the Great died, there's accounts that there was a star that was added to the sky that night, and for years they believed that there was a star that was added to the sky. Whether it actually was a star that was a comet that was passing through, we don't know. And there have been all kinds of theories. When you get into this whole idea of this star that went before them, there are all kinds of theories, and scientists have tried to explain it. They've tried to explain that there was an alignment of certain planets, and Jupiter was involved, and Jupiter was supposed to be the planet of the kings, and so forth, and so on. Some have said that it was a comet that appeared and traveled for a certain amount of days. However you want to explain it, the fact is God created the world and poked every star in the sky that's up there in the first place. Why would it be abnormal for God to actually create a star in honor of his coming to earth? I mean, scientists try to explain this stuff away, and they try to get rid of the wonderment of it. However it worked, this star moved. Now that's an oddball kind of thing. Now, a new star being in the sky, a comet appearing, an eclipse, that kind of thing happened. But the star moved ahead of them. And this is what's fascinating to me. God revealed this star to them because these guys were looking, y'all. Part of the things that made them wise is they studied astrology or astronomy. Really, it was more astrology. They looked at the stars for guidance, kind of like astrologists do today. And so they were in tune to this star. And it's always bugged me that a new star appears over your town and you don't notice it, but some guys 1,000 miles away in a foreign land notice that there's a new star right above your house, and you don't pay attention to it. You ever thought about that? This star was bright enough that these guys saw it from way over in another land. They saw this star, and they were willing to follow it because they knew there was something special there. But the guys that were sitting there in Bethlehem, Bethlehem is 6 miles from Jerusalem. 6 miles from the capital, and nobody there actually looked up and said, "Hey, that's interesting. There's a bright light above us." Nobody made that connection because they weren't looking. And they have no excuse not to. Because if you go back to Daniel, I keep referring back to Daniel, if you go back to the second part of the book of Daniel, Daniel gave all these prophecies, and in those prophecies, he talks about the different beasts that are going to come up with all these weird horns and stuff that are coming out of. But in that, he gives a very definite time that in so many days, a Savior is going to come. And if you go back and do the dates, to the very day Christ was born. To the very day Christ was crucified. To the very day that was prophesied some 600 years before. So there was this pregnancy of anticipation among those who were studying the prophets. And then it would have been uncommon for these Magi to understand these prophecies and to be looking for a star to happen, to appear, because if indeed they came from Persia, if you remember way back in history, there had been a lot of captivity, a lot of Jewish exiles that had been captured and taken into captivity, and they were there in Persia, like Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, and these guys. Daniel gives his prophecy there. These things filter down, and if your job is to be a scholar, you're not just going to study the stuff that's pertinent to your society. You're going to study everything that's going on around you. So they would have been familiar with these prophecies, and when a new star appears in the horizon, and they look and it's toward the area of Judea, of Jerusalem, they would think, you know what, that may be fulfilling that prophecy that there's going to be a king of kings coming out of that little bitty town called Bethlehem, back from that prophet named Micah. They would have known these terms. They would have been familiar with it. So they packed Charlie out. And here's the deal. I'm going to probably destroy something that you may like. The idea of 3 kings on the back of camels going through the desert, it didn't happen. 3 kings carrying a box of gold, a box of frankincense, and a box of myrrh out in the middle of the desert in the night traveling by themselves. They're not making it to Bethlehem. They're not making it to Jerusalem, because those thieves and those robbers and those shepherds that are out in the fields by night watching their flocks, they're going to look down there and they're going to see these guys with the big pointy hats and on these camels with these fine saddles on them. They're going to go, those guys are rich. We're not. And then we're going to become rich because we're going to knock them in the head. That was common. You think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Thievery and robbery was a common element in those days along when you traveled. You didn't travel by yourself. If you were going to make a 1,000-mile journey from one place to another through the desert, you traveled with a caravan. You got in a group. If you think about when Jesus was coming back from the temple as a 12-year-old boy, when he's coming back from the temple, the caravan was so large that Mary and Joseph lost him for a day before they realized that he was gone, because he was off somewhere down, they thought he was off somewhere down the line in the caravan playing with his friends. That was a common element. If you traveled in a group. These 3 kings, these Magi, they would not have been sent with these precious gifts from a foreign land by themselves. At the very least, they would have had a full military escort. So when they're traveling